Okay, I'm talking. I just was getting everything set up now.
Oh, got it. Thank you.
Ready to start. This is our second week together of thinking about thinking. And as you are aware, right, we're doing a series of connected classes on what we're learning about how we think, about how our minds operate, about how human reason is organized, what its powers are, what its limits are, in part because it seems, on the one hand, that we have made some remarkable breakthroughs in thinking about what we can call loosely cognitive science and philosophy of mind over, let's say, again, loosely the last 30 years, and that it's worthwhile trying to consolidate what we've learned and to see if it changes anything we think about ourselves. And on the other hand, because we are in the midst of a truly transformative technological revolution, the most recent and perhaps the most profound episode of which is the arrival of thinking machines, artificial intelligence, machines that at least seem to be able to learn on their own with some training from us. And on the one hand, this gives us another opportunity to think about, well, in what respects are we similar to, and in what respects do we differ from the thinking machines that we are currently engineering? Is their pattern of cognition sufficiently either similar to ours or else developed in different ways on its own to begin considering whether we have ethical obligations to our thinking devices? Are there ways of thinking uh, going to present opportunities for us or possible dangers and threats to us? And so multiple motivations. Today, I want to really try to ground us in the history of philosophy, where my focus will be, with apologies, exclusively on Western or European philosophical traditions. And that is not because I don't think there are things of value in other traditions. I want to be absolutely clear about that at the outset. But because of the limits of my own knowledge and competence, I feel like I can give you a wham bang tour of the history of Western thinking about thinking as it's been carried by the philosophical and theological traditions. I don't feel I can do that for other cultures. And so I have to leave that to somebody else. So today I'm going to talk about, in particular, what I'm going to call the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns on the nature of the human mind and our access to it. And so I've got an image that I imagine many of us are familiar with. I've used it before, Raphael's, from the Vatican, the School of Athens. But I've selected, of course, just the dialogue between Plato and Aristotle, and those are the ancients that I will focus on, those two. And by the way, they actually did coincide in time and history. We could actually maybe have witnessed something akin to this scene, probably not with bound books. That's a little anachronistic, but it is the case that Aristotle was Plato's student. Aristotle eventually founded a rival school to Plato's academy, and the debate between them may very well have ultimately have even influenced Plato's mature thinking. It's certainly the reaction to and against Platonic philosophy shaped Aristotle's philosophy. And then on the bottom, I've got an image I copied from a book, which shows a different kind of dialogue. And I think when we get to modern philosophy, for the most part, we're not dealing with individuals who actually knew and taught each other, but who nevertheless influenced each other primarily through their published ideas. And so we have an imagined conversation here between Descartes, Kant, and Nietzsche. And maybe those are the big three. I'm not going to focus exclusively on these three, but the idea that there is an implicit dialogue between them, that modern philosophy is a discourse carried by books through which these philosophers communicate with each other, respond to each other, conduct their debates, I think is a valid approach to thinking about the history of philosophy. So I indicated a practical motivation for this course last week, which I tied to the development of the thought of Hannah Arendt and her claim that we are in the 20th century, now I think we can say in the 21st century, increasingly a thoughtless culture and civilization. That's in part because our culture lacks the conceptual resources for thought to think itself adequately. We have become, as she famously puts it, in the human condition, laboring animals. We think of all that we do in terms of our capacity to produce things that satisfy our want or generate income and wealth for us. We no longer think of the unique and specific value of coming together as equals in order to determine collectively how we are going to organize our life together. And that in a society in which action is translated and channeled into labor, we end up without cultivating the capacity for freedom and for judgment. And the result is the idea of someone like Eichmann, who just does what he's told, even if what he's told to do is one of the most monstrous crimes in the history of humanity. It doesn't occur to him to question the orders or his superiors, or that maybe he has a higher duty other than conforming to the expectations on him given his role in an institution. So I hope all of this is familiar, right? We talked about it last week. The worry that especially in a world where more and more of our attention is captured by electronic devices that are perpetually with us and perpetually tether us to a world beyond the world immediately around us, therefore, in Arendt's words, unworld us. There is this, I think, amplified concern that we are not thinking enough and thinking about thinking. Now, this may sound odd, right? What do you mean we're not thinking? Isn't that constant buzz in my head, the inescapable chatter of my mind, thinking? What else is all of that talk, talk, talk going on in my head? And in thinking about that for a moment, the lines that Claudius speaks in Shakespeare's Hamlet in the third act, the third scene, where he's bent over in prayer over the awful deeds that he's done, killing his own brother, right? And he says, you know, I have words, but that go up to heaven, but my thoughts stay here in this world. And he then, in one of these rhyming couplets that often end these Shakespearean monologues, says, my words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Word without thoughts never to heaven go. And
Mhm.
what Arendt has in mind with Eichmann is well captured in that Shakespeare quote, that yes, We can have words, we can have cliches, we can have hackneyed phrases, we can have ordinary, mundane uh, dialogue occurring in our heads. But that part of what distinguishes the capacity for thought is not just the constant motion of language in our minds. It is the capacity to distance ourselves from received ideas and to think again, to think anew, and in so doing, to open some critical distance between our received ideas and our own judgment about whether or not those received ideas deserve our consent or our continued allegiance and fidelity. And that when Arendt is saying that thought is in danger and that modern society is increasingly thoughtless, she doesn't mean that we are zombies, but she does mean that we are increasingly less critical, in part because we are, in the words of another critic, entertaining ourselves to death, as opposed to finding the time, the solitude, the quietude required, and then the doing the hard work of thinking for ourselves about whether the ideas that we are using are worth maintaining or need to be revised. We concluded last week by talking about two different historical trees of ideas, one of them philosophical approaches where we'll concentrate today that go back to the aspiration to have a solid foundation for human knowledge to be found in metaphysics and ontology. That's Plato and Aristotle, and then their Christian reception and transmission. I'll say more about that in just a moment. The way this gives rise to some deep doubt from Descartes and Hobbes, and then eventually to more modern philosophical theories from Hume to Kant, eventually to the phenomenological tradition, which gets its inception in Hegel and then moves forward to Heidegger and others, and then contemporary approaches where I'm going to primarily concentrate on what is called by its adherents intersubjectivity, the idea that as opposed to the solitary mind reflecting upon itself, we need to recognize that what we do when we think is to participate in a fundamentally social activity, and that we need to understand not the isolated mind, but the mind as it exists in the social networks and using the social resources provided by our language, our history, our culture. Then the second approach, the objectivating approach, says, well, maybe not everything we need to know about how we think is intuitively or reflectively self-accessible. Maybe as opposed to that, we need to step outside of the self and treat the self not as a subject reflecting upon itself, but as an object in the way that we would treat any other object of scientific inquiry. And this gives rise to a whole train of psychological approaches, which we will begin to look at in more detail next week. Now, I want to say just a little bit more about this divide between introspective and objectivating methodology. And so the fundamental choice between those two trees. And I want to preview my conclusion, which is I think that frankly, we don't have to choose, and that the adherents of each of these schools often see mutual incompatibility between their approaches when in fact, what they're really trying to do is just stake out their territory, and that there's no reason we shouldn't be able, if we're not party to this dispute, to learn from both and to understand both the insights and limits of each approach. Having said that, we then need to get some clarity about what each is good at and maybe also what its limits are. So let's start with introspection and the critique of philosophical access to the mind that gave rise to the psychological approach. And here the simple idea is that there is more going on in the brain and the mind than we can see when we reflect upon ourselves. And so I've selected two images from modern art to illuminate this basic idea. Picasso's Girl Looking in a Mirror, in which, right, we see on the one hand the girl presumably as she actually is, and then on the other hand, the way she appears to herself when she reflects upon herself. And of course, there's a great deal of distortion. In this case, it appears not to be a flattering, but in fact, a demeaning distortion. And by the way, of course, neither one of these images looks very much the way a real human being looks. And so Picasso is also um, calling our attention to the subjective or constructive nature of his perspective on this scene. And then a person who, artist whose work I like a lot on these topics, Rene Magritte, with this image of a man looking in the mirror. Right, and the as opposed to the image we started with, right, the image of Socrates looking in a mirror and seeing perhaps deeply into himself. Marguerite worries that when he looks in the mirror, his true self turns its back on him, right? And the idea that perhaps the majority of what actually determines what we think and how our minds work, how we reason, how we act, how we judge, is not consciously available to us, is unconscious, is automatic, is unreflective, is part of the motivation then for the shift into objectivating and psychological approaches. You're a fool if you think that everything that's going on in your mind is stuff that you're aware of, says Freud, says B.F. Skinner, says Daniel Kahneman, etc. Right? And so this idea that, as opposed to simply assuming that with sufficient rigor, method, energy, commitment, we can eventually use our minds to unpack themselves and discern why we think what we think, we need an entirely different approach. And this then gets us to the limits of the psychophysical reductionism that tends to be present in the objectivating approach, right? So I'm starting with the limits on each of these approaches. If the philosophical approach starts from the idea that everything in the mind is ultimately available to the mind, it's making a fundamental mistake about how much is unconscious. The response from the philosophers to the psychologists is to say, well, okay, let's step out of the mind and look at the brain as a object in the same way that we look at the stomach or the liver or the calf as an object for medical, biological, chemical analysis. And there are limits and really serious distortions that result when we start thinking in this way. And so the analogy that is often used, right? I've got a glass of water here, and I can just treat it as water, let it quench my thirst or bathe in it. But if I really want to understand, why does it boil at the temperature it boils at? Why does it freeze at the temperature it freezes at? Why, when it freezes, is it less dense than when it's liquid? That's a peculiar property of water. Why does it interact in certain chemical reactions? For instance, in photosynthesis, which is pretty important to understanding the way the world works, I probably need to stop treating it intuitively just as water and start thinking about it in a more objectivating perspective that gets at its uh, fundamental structural nature. Let's call it H2O, because ultimately what we naively call water is a substance composed of atoms, and those atoms are organized as molecules, and those molecules, in fact, are formed by two hydrogen and one oxygen uh, atom, with certain ways of binding to each other, given how their electrons are organized. And that helps to account for all of these other properties that we maybe understand intuitively, but that we need to better understand scientifically. So that's an example of a physical reductive explanation giving us greater insight. If I then turn to a effort to understand what's going on in my mind with a similar process. And so I say, I'm looking at the Mona Lisa, right? I'm looking at one of the great paintings of art, the painting that Da Vinci spent so many years struggling to perfect. And I have this um, transformative experience when I see it. I see the kinds of perfection that human artistic creation can produce, and the right reductive account of that is that my visual cortex is being stimulated. And by the way, that's the same thing that's happening when I'm watching the Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial during the commercial break in the Warriors game, right? My visual cortex is being stimulated. And I want to say, well, okay, that's correct up to a point, but it's not very insightful. There's a reason that I turn off or fast forward or at least try to ignore the KFC commercial, but I stand there in hypnotized awe when I'm looking at the Mona Lisa. And that's not captured by visual cortex stimulation, even though that may be the right description of what's going on in my brain at those two moments. Similarly, let's say we want to offer a uh, psychophysical explanation of what's going on when I'm with a person I love, right? And so there's some account of a dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin stew coursing through my brain, and that warmth, that security, that completeness that I experience when I'm with the person I love. That is perhaps at a neurochemical level adequately explained by saying it's because I've got high levels of dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin coursing through me at the moment. And I hear somebody laughing in the background. Yes, that's if that's all you got to say about love, then good luck, because right, we have struggled for millennia to articulate in a humanistic vocabulary what it means to feel that somebody completes you and that you have a deep connection such that you're soulmates with that person, right? And the idea that that involves certain neurotransmitters reaching high levels, fine. I don't want to disagree with that. And that may actually be important, but it is not an adequate explanation of what I'm experiencing. And so to unpack this a little bit, the first thing to say is that there are phenomenological experiences, right? So what does it feel like to be in love? What does it feel like to be angry? What does it feel like to be in pain? And unless the thing in question has those phenomenological features, has that sense from the inside, this is what it's like to have this experience, the fact that the objective neurochemical markers are present doesn't make it actually an experience of love. Let's say, I don't know, when you take a hit of heroin, you have exactly this experience. Maybe that's why heroin is so addictive. But having said that, I don't think even heroin addicts would say that what they experience when they have their shot is love, right? And so to assist the uh, project of psychophysical reductionism, of objectivating psychological approaches, they need us to give the phenomenological correlate. They can't actually exclude it. They need to know, is that love or is that just a drug, right? Second of all, that the subjective experience has an ineliminable perspective dependence to it. It's me who's love, in love with that particular person. It's me who recently came to realize that I really, really admire Vermeer, who up until recently I hadn't spent much time on, right? And so we have to recognize that this perspective that makes this experience my experience is essential to what it's like to have the experience. And so we, again, cannot aim to eliminate the philosopher's respond, the introspective dimension, the subjective dimension. We have to be uh, honest with ourselves about the fact that that is a real aspect of the experience. And then finally, that there is something interpretive and um, contestable about articulating the interior experience. Are you in love, or are you merely experiencing infatuation, right? So I say to my son, I understand that this person is very important to you at the moment, but please, you've only been with her for a few weeks, and you've got to recognize that you may end up feeling differently about her after 6 months or a year or 5 years. And so, no, Dad, I know she's the one. I'm deeply in love, right? And at some point, we have to recognize that through our interpretations, we are partially constituting the experiences that we have. And that means that there's an interpretive and contestable um, dimension to the interior nature of our experience. And again, I don't want to say there's no insight in pointing out that when my dopamine receptors or production are inhibited, it's going to be more difficult maybe for me to feel closeness to the person I love. And that may open up ways of helping me and treating me. But having said that, that's not going to exhaust the description. And so I want to then move to the positive, right? So I think both the philosophical and the psychological approaches have important limits that the other points out. What about the insights? And so the objectivating approach, the psychological approach, I think has real insights, and it's part of my excitement about sharing this material with you. The dual process and embodied cognition approaches in particular have helped us to see, for instance, why we are liable to make certain cognitive mistakes, mistakes in our judgment. Why, for instance, the judge who considers a parole case when they've just had a nice, healthy lunch and they're feeling very good and satisfied is much more likely to be sympathetic and lenient than they are right before lunch when they're feeling hungry and grumpy. It really turns out that our affect, our mood, deeply influences our judgment. And recognizing that is extremely important to judging well, right? So that's just one example of the kind of thing that we're going to get into much more deeply later in the course, but it helps us to correct our biases and the way in which they're rooted in unconscious forms of organizing our decision making heuristics that we use in forming our judgments. And I do also have to say that when it comes to understanding and healing trauma, understanding the way in which trauma is rooted in both body and brain, often more so in body than brain, and the way in which, therefore, therapy that is cognitive and behavioral and that perhaps treats the embodied dimension of the trauma as much as the uh, memory of the trauma that is cognitively available, I think has been incredibly important in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And so finally, the idea that we are not just in our minds or brains, but that a lot of our cognition is actually present in our intellectual technology that surrounds us, right? Just try doing complex math or even relatively simple math, balancing your checkbook without pencil and pen, right? Or I'm sorry, pencil and paper, right? That's the intellectual technology that we rely on a daily basis. Or maybe it's the phone. Maybe you just say to your phone, what's 172 and 59 cents plus $214.32, right? And the phone does the math for you. But in a world in which our technology is rapidly changing, it has really important cognitive implications to appreciate the way in which cognition is embodied not only beyond the brain and the mind, but also in our environment. So really important insights. And I'll get into in just a few minutes some of the insights of the philosophical approach. But I do think we are much richer in the way that Hannah Arendt, for instance, demonstrates for having a penetrating conceptual vocabulary for interpreting ourselves. And this is what the elaboration of philosophical approaches to mind and cognition provide us with. So, having said that, um, let me then go back to some of what I now want to say are the dangers of the objectivating approach, because I'll just note the objectivating approach is ascendant right now. Um, and that's in part because we are in the middle of, or perhaps the tail end of a scientific revolution. But I do think that the scientific revolution in brain science is really still in its early stages, and we're learning more and more about how the brain provides the architecture of cognition, how it structures through networks, through chemical processes, through different regions of the brain, different aspects of the way we think. So, what are some of the dangers and limits? I think that the first danger is self objectification. And obviously, there's a whole literature about the way in which girls and young women are increasingly doing this through self presentation on social media. That's not per se what I'm talking about here. I guess I'm talking more about this idea that we might be tempted to reduce our self description to the physiological basis in the brain. And if we are self interpreting animals, if our interpretations in part constitute our experiences, and if we end up as a result of psychophysical reductionism with impoverished self interpretations, then we may not be alive to the complexity, the bittersweet nature, the vulnerability that comes with being in love. Similarly, when it comes to the fact that we have greater and greater understanding of behavioral and science, how, for instance, addiction works, we can engineer addiction, right? And we can do it through our food supply, right? And I think there's growing evidence that ultra processed food rewires the brain and the connection between the areas in the brain that account for our appetite and desire and the areas in the brain that control our reward circuitry, and that our food is increasingly engineered to addict us at a neurochemical level. And that is decidedly unhealthy. There's some studies that suggest that up to 80% of the causes of mortality in uh, advanced industrial or post-industrial societies like the United States and Britain can be traced back to the unhealthy food supplies that we have. And obviously, right, our electronic devices are also engineered to addict us, to capture our attention, to fracture it, and to demand that we are constantly on screen, online, on this platform or that platform. This is a danger that I think we have to really recognize comes with the increased understanding of mind and brain. And then the final thing I want to emphasize just at this preliminary methodological level is the need to strike a balance, right? And so if we think there are dangers that accompany the objectivating approach, maybe we need to use the philosophical resources to begin to persuade ourselves that we shouldn't self objectivate or that we should regulate some of this technology. If we believe that the dual process theory has shown the way in which, for instance, racial bias and prejudice are unconscious and our best conscious efforts to counter them are seriously limited in their capacity to actually change the way in which they operate on us unconsciously, then we may need to take that into account as we train police or as we try to reform our behavior. We can trade between these two approaches depending upon what we're trying to accomplish. There's also, I think, the growing recognition that the two approaches have different fundamental objectives. Is our objective to understand and interpret ourselves from the inside, or is it to explain ourselves from the outside? And those are pretty distinct projects, but they do not have to compete with as opposed to complementing each other. But I do think there is one respect, at least, in which I want to give primacy to the philosophical approach, which is to say that we need ethical and political regulation of what we do with the increased power over ourselves and each other that cognitive psychology potentially generates as we have a better understanding of the way in which the behavioral sciences indicate we operate cognitively and how we get addicted, how our attention operates, how our appetites operate. We may also, and this will be a topic for another day, need to start thinking a little bit more about cognitive privacy, the right to control our own data that is gathered by the devices that we use about our brains. So I just want to stop for one moment. I'm about to jump into the much more philosophical discussion, get us into Plato and Aristotle, but I've covered some stuff of substance already. Um, are there questions or thoughts? Is this making sense? Anybody have something they want to ask or remark on at this moment? All right, I'm not hearing anything. I know you guys aren't shy, so I assume you would tell me if you needed.
Oh, I have a comment.
Go ahead, Flossie.
What I'm picking up is that when it comes to recognizing that you're in love or you're about to be infatuated, you are thinking with the gut. Because what happens is that the whole digestive system constricts, and you know that something has happened, and it's not that you want to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Um, and I think it's worthwhile noting, right? We are evolved creatures, and we actually had guts, digestive tracts before we had brains, right? Our guts actually have
Yes.
complex neural networks in them, and they feed into the brain. And whether it is love or fear or anger or outrage, and we could keep going, disgust, right? The panoply of emotions. When we look at what's going on in the body, when somebody says, that's what I'm feeling, what we see is that the neural input originates in the gut, right? And then it is transmitted to the brain. But having said that, as I understand this, it's not exclusively in the gut, right? So one way to put this is these emotions are somatically generated, right? They originate in the body, not in the brain. But having said that, then the brain has to interpret what's going on in the body, right? So there's the old, I want to say, Warner Brothers cartoon image of infatuation, right, where the wolf looks at the female wolf and woo-wah, and the eyes pop out of the head, right? And that originates in the stomach too. But as opposed to infatuation or love, we tend to call that lust, right? And so some sense of being able to interpret what's coming from the stomach. Is it a stable and deep desire to want to share the rest of my life with this person? Or is it, boy, I'd really like to take a tumble in the hay with them? That involves the mind as well as the gut, and the mind, in a sense, interpreting what it's getting from the gut. And people who have high levels of emotional intelligence are better doing that, right? And people who are not as good. may be less good at interpreting that somatic input their gut is giving them to be clear what's actually going on. So yes, you're absolutely right, Flossie. This isn't all in the mind, and I'll put it in a different way. The mind isn't all in the brain, right? Mind is in the gut. And by the way, the mind is in my pencil and my paper and my phone and the books on the shelf behind me and the photographs I look over to reminisce about the experiences I had 20 years ago that I may not remember with much clarity anymore. That's all part of the way in which we think. And so this idea that we're going to get to later of the expanded mind hypothesis, that the mind is not exclusively in the brain or exclusively in the body, I think is really important and insightful. Thank you for that, Flossie. Anybody else at this juncture? All right, so I'm going to move into the Greeks, and I'm going to start us out where we often start in this discussion. That, by the way, just so you recognize is the trajectory we're on. And I'm going to, as I say, reconstruct the history of philosophy, at least with regards to the themes I'm interested in for this class, as a dialectic, right? As a conversation across millennia where the later thinkers are responding to what they see as the limits or problems of the earlier thinkers and to see themselves as continuing a discourse. That discourse often is traced back to Plato. And I'm not going to try in the limited time we have to give us a complete introduction to one of the most prolific and most studied philosophers of the canon, but I do want us to get a sense of the approach that Plato struck to understanding the mind and how it generates knowledge, especially self-knowledge, right? And so I think that the place to start is with the anxiety that Plato inherited from his philosophical predecessors and contemporaries about what we call the mutability of the natural world. That's supposed to be world, not world, which I'm not sure is even a word. And so the idea that, as one of his contemporaries famously put it, you can never set your foot into the same river twice, right? The world is in such constant flux that the Greeks had some sense that there were particles smaller than that we could see that made up the world, and that they might be constantly changing even as we encountered apparent surface stability. But then if you take a sufficiently long perspective, everything is changing all the time. Are we even composed of the same atoms, the same particles throughout our life? Or might we at the end of our lives have none of the same material that we began our life with? Why do we even then maintain that we are the same selves across a full life? And we add to that the senses are obviously unreliable. You may have noticed that I've turned the light on. It wasn't on at first because it's clouded over, it's getting ready to storm, and I wanted you to be able to see me, right? And so what kind of creatures are we such that a change in light changes fundamentally what we see, despite the fact that we know that that's a superficial change. It doesn't change anything deep about the nature of the scene in front of you or the objects that populate the scene, but nevertheless, they deeply change their appearance. Doesn't that mean that we are outfitted with equipment to understand the world that are deeply deficient in their capacity to grasp the world. And this is then the origins of the metaphysical impulse that is at the root of the ancient philosophical tradition, the idea that somehow we need to get above or beyond the physical world to escape both the perpetual flux of this world and the limited resources with which we have to understand this world. And this then for Plato is to suggest that we are equipped with a different capacity that does not depend on the senses and does not merely try to understand the show of the senses in the world, but that we also have reason, logos. And this allows us to reach a higher, truer reality. And that once we are in possession of an understanding of that true reality, that intellect and reason allows us to comprehend without the mediation of the senses or the need to try to comprehend the physical world, we can then return and have true insight into the physical world as well. Plato expressed this in several ways, but perhaps the most famous way he expressed it is in the allegory of the cave. Let me make sure I get this right. This is in the book 7 of the Republic. And he tells a story there of human beings who are imprisoned, shackled, right, in a cave that lets no light in. And in that cave, they're allowed to look only at a wall. On that wall, there are images, but those images are from shadow puppets, right? So there's some source of light, a flame behind where they are shackled, and then there are shadow puppets moving such that they generate images on the wall. And people who are in this condition, which Plato suggests is the ordinary human condition, confuse what they see, the shadows on the wall, for all there is, the reality of the world. And this um, part of the allegory is meant to convey that ordinary human beings do not think for themselves. They use only the received concepts, categories, ideas of their society. And so in that sense, they're relying on things that they haven't thought through, use their own intellect and reason to comprehend, and things that have been thought through by others who also have not fully developed their reason. And so even the shadows are of puppets, not of real things. And he then speaks of an individual escaping from their shackles, making their way to the outside of the cave, and that at first these individuals would be blinded by the insight that they would have uh, as a result of being exposed to the sun for the first time, that they wouldn't be able to comprehend, they would be overwhelmed, but that slowly through gradual immersion in this new world and study of it, they would come to understand that there are real objects and that they are illuminated by the sun, not by the fake light of the cave, and that they need to be understood as such. A different metaphor that Plato suggests in the Republic also is a metaphor of a line where we have here words and ideas that are generated by others and that therefore are cut off from the real world, that do not rely on intellect. And that the first way we begin to use our intellect to understand the world is through mathematical reasoning. And that mathematics is, in a sense, preparatory for philosophy. And that once we have begun to understand that mathematical numerals and equations and theorems represent the work of the intellect, of reason, and that they allow us to actually better understand the world. The Pythagorean theorem, but also Pythagoras's work, sorry, on music and understanding musical scales allowed us to make much better music, that we can better understand the world if we use the tools our intellect gives us. In other words, if we leave the cave, we can then go back into the cave and help other people who may never be able to make the journey out of the cave, at least to have better knowledge or an approximation of it within the cave. Once we've done the mathematics, we can then begin to think about the forms themselves, the pure intellectual concepts and categories that reason alone gives us, that we can use to better understand the world. And Plato, of course, suggests that the form of the good, the highest form, is like the sun, that which illuminates everything. So Plato develops this idea of relying exclusively on reason as a philosopher in order to understand a higher, deeper truth that then, once it's understood, allows us to better navigate the changeable and poorly understood world. He, of course, thinks that philosophers in an ideal republic would rule because only they would have the knowledge to be true captains of state. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, in saying that reason allows us insight into deeper truth, Plato recognizes at the same time that reason isn't the only faculty contained in what he called the soul. I'll point out very briefly that the Greeks used the term psyche for soul, what we call psyche, and so it may have less metaphysical implications than it has for us in light of the Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic tradition. But he suggested that the wellspring of human action and thought contain competing forces, that we often know what the logical or best thing to do is, but we're often tempted to do something else. Why is that? Well, because there's an appetitive or desirous part of the soul, and for many of us, it's stronger. I know I shouldn't have that dessert at midnight. It's not going to agree with me, and I don't need the calories or the cholesterol, but damn, it's hard to resist. Oops, I just ate it, right? And so it's not easy to be ruled by reason. And by the way, there's another part to the soul, the spirited part of the soul, which accounts for people who are courageous or quick to anger or motivated by other deep emotions, right? And this seems to Plato to be distinct from appetite and reason. And he suggests that for different people, these different faculties are more or less strong, that some people have the capacity to have their reason developed over time with careful training, such that they can truly use their reason to master their spirit and their appetite. And the metaphor that Plato used was of a charioteer with two horses, and ultimately those who could be philosophers were those who could control the horses to guide the chariot down the right path, to tame spirit and appetite and be governed by reason. Other people would be governed either by reason, I'm sorry, either by spirit or appetite. That's the majority of humanity, and they can be valuable in society because there's a division of labor in society, but only those who are governed by reason are equipped to rule and educate men. And by the way, being able to be governed by reason requires a long training that helps one to subdue the soul and the appetite. Um, this gives rise to the idea that there's a fundamental division between the senses, which are bodily and give us impressions of the world, and the suprasensory, that which is above and superior to sensation, that the mind gives us. And this gives rise finally to the impulse to think beyond the limits of the known. What can reason reveal about the deepest truths of the universe, the nature of the good, its form, itself, irrespective of and independent from the particular instantiations of the good that we find in the world? Yes, that's a good wine. Yes, that's a good cup that you've got there to drink that wine with. But in saying that the wine and cup are good, you imply that you have some independent understanding of the concept or the form of the good. And we have to be able to understand that. And to understand that, Plato suggests we have to turn our mind away from the wine and the cup and the things of the world. And hence why Raphael has him painted pointing up, to turn the intellect to the higher realm, the metaphysical realm, to gain true knowledge. All right. A rushed introduction to Plato. I imagine this is something that perhaps some of us are already familiar with. I have talked about Plato with you before, though it's been many years. All that to say, I hope you got enough out of it to have a sense of Plato's approach to thinking about our minds, our souls, our capacity for logos or reason, as well as our emotional and appetitive natures. Anybody want to start us out with a thought, a question, a comment? Flossie, go ahead, and I think you're unmuted, so you
Okay.
can go right ahead.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yep.
Our book group shortly, not immediately, but in the next couple of weeks, will be reading Death in Venice by Thomas Mann.
Hmm.
We will be reviewing a lot of what you were telling us today.
Yeah, because of course Mann is in many ways in dialogue with Plato in Death in Venice. Yes. I just taught a wonderful essay by Helen Small on Mann, where she talks about Death in Venice.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah. I think I spoke with you guys about her book, The Long Life, when we were talking about the lifespan revolution. And she's got a great chapter about Mann and Mann's peculiar reading of Plato. In
Yes,
that.
exactly. Yes.
David, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that I've always taken away from the cave metaphor, well, two things. First of all, we seldom, if ever, get to see the thing itself. All we see are representations of it. And many times we see representations of representations. So if those images show up on the wall, we can start talking about them. So language becomes a third level representation. And then if we put the language into print, we have a fourth level representation. So we're always stuck with these images of the real thing, not the thing itself. And the second dilemma that I have with the cave metaphor is what makes us think that the light of the sun isn't just like all the other lights inside the cave, it's just bigger and brighter. And we deceive ourselves into believing that once we get out in the light of the sun, we see things for what they are. Maybe they're just another representation of this thing that we can never truly apprehend.
Good. And so let's note that part of what Plato is suggesting in suggesting that we typically live in a shadow realm, right? That what we encounter is, as you put it, representations and representations at several levels of remove from the thing itself, right? I think if I've got it right, the fundamental problem for Plato is that whatever the representation we have, and you point out, right, that we use words and concepts to represent things, and really when we're working in thought, what we're working with is words and concepts, not with the thing itself. But I would also point out that the other difficulty Plato was wrestling with is that everything that we think about is delivered to our minds by our senses, and our senses are notoriously unreliable. Right now, we are almost by necessity, right, encountering each other on our little screens as if we were seeing the screen itself, and as if the screen shows an accurate representation of the world itself. But let us remember, what we're really seeing is some electrochemical activity in the visual cortex that is giving rise to this image in the brain, right? It feels like it's out there in the world. We can't remove that necessary, in a sense, Plato wants to say, illusion. And so I think the deepest respect in which Plato is saying this is all unreliable and illusory is that we're confusing our sensory experience, which is locked in our brains, which, never encounter the world. It's actually been in some sort of terrible accident and we're in real danger, right? The brain is leaking out. That's not the word, right? That's an unreliable impression of the world. Now, to your second point, how do we know that what the intellect gives us when it engages in deep philosophical contemplation is any more true or penetrating or reliable? And here I want to say, I'm basically with you, but having said that, Plato's answer seems to rely on something akin to a mystical experience, right?
Yes, yes.
If you ultimately succeed via a long, tortuous philosophical path in training your reason to be able to contemplate the form of the good, you will immediately know that what you understand is a higher truth, a metaphysical reality that then will allow you deeper insight into the illusory world of the senses. And I don't share that experience. I've never contemplated good in a way that allowed me to go, oh my goodness, there it is. Maybe I would be in a divinity school as opposed to a philosophy department if I had not had that experience. But having said that, that's the claim that Plato was making, is only those people who have come out of the cave via, he thinks it takes 50 years of training, right? Those people do know the highest truth. By the way, right, Aristotle went through this whole rigorous training for the whole time and was probably Plato's most gifted student. And he came to the conclusion, nah, I don't think it's working either, right? So it's not only me and you who have these reservations about Plato's answer. And anybody else today? All right.
Just
Yeah,
a quick
go ahead,
response to that.
Oh, David, go ahead.
It's this dilemma that has driven me to adopt the philosophy of pragmatism, where
Mhm.
I've given up a search for truth, and what I look for is a search for insight. And insights are measured not so much by their inherent quality, but for the consequences they have in our world, on ourselves, on others with whom we interact. So the measure of the truth or beauty or goodness of a thing is in terms of what good, bad, or evil it does in this world.
Yeah, and I think it was William James who said, beliefs are rules for action, right? We should judge them not on the basis of their ultimate truth, but on the way the world they produce answers
Yeah.
to our needs and interests. And so yes, I'll just point out to you very quickly that next week we'll discuss Kant in some detail, right? And Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, I think there's a residual Platonism in Kant as well, but what he believes reason can detect is not some higher realm of forms with an ultimate form in it, but reason itself. And that reason gives us, among other things, moral directives and laws, rules with which to live by. And I have to say, I find that version of perhaps a metaphysical view of reason to be more persuasive than the Platonic view. I couldn't tell. Iris, were you raising your hand? You're still muted, Iris.
We live in a world of relativity. We recognize the changing nature of our environment, our knowledge base, our experiences. And so I'm concerned that the people who come through with the truth, whether it's religious, cults, or it's other forms of, they are so sure of the truth. And how do we overcome that when we're creating an AI environment that's feeding it with being fed by the very mistakes we have in our literature and our scientific omnibus?
Yeah, wonderful comment and very rich and very important, Iris. Thank you. I'm going to start with the idea that we live in a world of relativity, right? And at first I thought maybe you were saying that in an Einsteinian sense, but I think you're really saying it in a much more cultural sense, right? And the fact that we are so frequently in the contemporary world confronted with other cultures who don't believe what we believe and who don't organize their lives the way we organize our lives provokes in many of us a kind of intolerant absolutism, right? What do you mean there's another way of doing things? No, this is the only right way of doing things. And that this is something that obviously we have to be aware of, and we have to have the resources to counter, and we have to, I hope, be able to open people's eyes to the idea that there's a richness to the diversity of human cultures. There's a way in which we can learn from each other. There are ways in which we can have greater appreciation for our own values in light of having encountered that diversity. So as opposed to threatening, this can be invigorating. Now, having said that, different people have different psychologies, different people have different levels of security. I think one of the things that we need to aim to do if we want people to not have a conservative, reactionary attitude to difference is to try to increase the level of material security, the level of status security, so that we aren't as threatened by those who are different from us. Having said all of that, I also want to just open up the question, because you say at the end, there's all this AI, there's all this social media, there's all this disinformation, right? And in order to be able to refer to something as disinformation, as propaganda, as untrue, we also have to be able to at some point say, and we know this because we have some sense of what is true, right? Of what is valid. Maybe we're pragmatists like David, but we have our pragmatic theory of what makes the belief that we know who won the presidential election of 2020, that we have confidence in what medical and biological science tells us about what the vaccine for the the COVID, right, virus does and doesn't do, right? That at some point we need to be able to draw a line between this is the stuff that there's a diversity of and that is relative, or that we need to tolerate, and this is the stuff that we're pretty confident there's shouldn't be so much controversy about, even though maybe there is right now. And we're going to stand our ground and not say, you've got your view on the vaccine and I've got my view, but that when it comes to medical science, there are better and worse answers, and convincing people who have the wrong answer to change their mind is actually going to be very important for all of our health and safety, right? And so some relativity, but some objectivity as well. All right, I think that might be a good place to end for today. Good as always being with you guys. Hope you do something for Flossie tonight for her birthday. Yeah, no, you deserve it. And take care, everybody. I'll see you next week, and we'll keep the conversation going. Bye for now.
Bye.